Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing stories ever told in the dark Appalachian Mountains. As we explore this story that has been told for generations in forgotten taverns and written down on yellowed pages that few people dared to read. This video is a made-up story that was made just for fun. Any similarity to real people, living or dead, is purely coincidental. In 1894, West Virginia was a territory where the wilderness had not yet been fully tamed by progress. The Appalachian Mountains looked like sleeping giants, with thick forests that blocked out most of the sun, even at noon. There were small towns that were cut off from each other by deep valleys and misty peaks. The only way to get from one town to another was by narrow trails that wound through the thick vegetation. At that time, civilization seemed like a far-off promise, something that belonged to the big cities in the east. In the mountains, though, older, quieter laws were in charge. One autumn afternoon, as the leaves started to turn rusty and gold, Margaret Ellison came to that area. She came from somewhere unknown, with only a worn leather bag and stories she never fully told. People in the small town of Thornhill, which is between two steep hills, were wary of her because they didn't see many new people. Margaret had a kind of beauty that made people uneasy. It wasn't because she was perfect, but because her gaze was so strong. There was something about her that didn't fit in. When she walked into a room, the air felt heavier. She rented a room in the wooden boarding house on Thornhill's only main street. The owner was a middle-aged widow who wanted to know everything about her guests, but Margaret didn't give out many details. She said she worked with medicinal herbs, which she learned from distant relatives. Her skills quickly drew attention in a time when doctors were hard to find and expensive, especially in those far-off mountains. People started to come to her with chronic pain, fevers that wouldn't go away, and illnesses that traditional medicine didn't seem to be able to treat. The first few weeks were calm. Margaret saw patients in her small room, where she made poultices and tonics from plants she picked from the hills. Her name spread quickly. They said her hands were blessed and that her potions worked miracles. But along with the admiration, a strange sense of unease also grew. There was something about the way she came to see me every night, and the quiet rituals she did while making her medicines. The villagers started to notice strange things like candles being lit at odd times, chants in a language they didn't know, and symbols being scratched into the dirt in the backyard. In the small Appalachian towns of 1894, faith and superstition still went hand in hand. The stories of witchcraft that European colonists brought with them mixed with Native American legends and African beliefs, making a mix of fear and interest. Margaret seemed to know her way around this strange world all too well. She talked about pacts made at crossroads and portals that opened on nights without a moon. She knew the names of things that no one else would say. They said all of this in a casual, almost careless way, like they were talking about the weather or the harvest. The local pastor, a strict man who preached in a chapel with rotting planks, started to talk about public worries in his Sunday sermons. He warned that bad people were getting into the community and that fake healers were selling short-term relief in exchange for something much more valuable. He never said Margaret's name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. The tension grew like the fog that came down from the mountains at night, thick and impossible to get away from. Margaret didn't seem to care that people were suspicious. She kept working with the same level of dedication, maybe even more. Her eyes changed in a way that made it seem like she could see through people and read the secrets written in their souls. She started to make scary predictions about the future, like a barn that would catch fire, a flood that would destroy a plantation, and a traveler who would never reach his destination. Every time she made a correct prediction, it made people more scared. Every word she said was an omen that no one wanted to ignore. Things were different at night in Thornhill. The silence felt deeper, like it was full of anticipation. Dogs howled for no reason, crows gathered in large numbers on rooftops, and Margaret Ellison stayed in her room at the boarding house, making her potions, getting desperate visitors, and whispering words that sounded like they came from a time before people remembered. The story that was just starting to unfold in the dark mountains of West Virginia would become a legend, told in shaky voices for generations. It was a story of mystery and horror that no one could explain. That year, winter came early to West Virginia's Appalachian Mountains. The stillness that came with it was unsettling and seemed to suck the sound of the world away. The snow on the mountains made them look like a white shroud, making Thornhill even more cut off from the rest of the world. The roads became impassable, and the people who lived there were stuck in their wooden homes, relying on the food they had stored and each other's company during the long, cold months that lay ahead. Margaret Ellison seemed to do well in the freezing cold. While others huddled around the fires, she walked along the snow-covered paths with an almost magical ease. Her steps left deep marks in the ice, but she never seemed to feel the weight of winter on her shoulders. They said they saw her gathering plants even when everything was frozen, pulling roots from places where nothing should grow, and talking to the bare trees like they were old friends. That winter was when the nightly meetings started. People who said they didn't want to be involved in shady business ended up knocking on Margaret's door at night. They came with quiet requests and wants that they wouldn't dare say out loud. They wanted to be rich while everyone else was poor. They wanted their enemies to have bad luck. They wanted to win over people who didn't care, and Margaret took care of them all with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and charged prices that were much higher than coins. The boarding house where she was staying had become a strange place. The owner, who had been asking Margaret a lot of questions, now stayed away from her room altogether. She said she got chills when she walked through the hallway and heard voices when she knew the guest was alone. Other people who lived in the boarding house said they had vivid nightmares, like dreams where they walked through forests that never ended while being chased by things they couldn't see. Some people woke up with strange marks on their skin, scratches they didn't remember getting, or bruises that showed up for no reason. The Reverend preached more strongly. In 1894, the word of a man of faith still meant a lot in those far-off places, and he used all of his power to warn people about the dangers Margaret posed. He set up prayer vigils, which were meetings where people who believed in God came together to ask for protection from the evil forces they thought were coming. But even among the most religious people, there were those who secretly looked for Margaret because they thought she could help them in ways that prayer couldn't. Thornhill was consumed by duality. During the day, people acted like everything was fine, said hello to each other politely, and talked about the bad weather and the problems of winter. But when night fell and the mountains were covered in darkness, a different reality appeared. There were lights flickering in Margaret's bedroom windows, and shadows moved with purpose. The air was charged with an electricity that made hair stand on end, and there was a tension that felt like it came before storms that never came. Margaret started to talk openly about what she called balance. She said that the world we see is just a thin layer stretched over deep abysses, and that people who knew where to press could break that layer and get to what was on the other side. She said that knowledge was power, but that you had to give something up to get power. In this universe and every other, nothing was free. Every wish granted left a mark, and every deal made opened a door that might have been better left closed. Animals in the area started acting strangely. Horses wouldn't go near the inn, chickens stopped laying eggs, and dogs that used to be friendly became aggressive for no reason. In the pasture, a farmer found his sheep standing still in a perfect circle, all looking at the same point on the horizon. They ran away in fear when he got close, but the circle stayed in the snow, as if something heavy had pushed down on the ground. Tales about Margaret grew from quiet whispers to full-blown legends. Some people said she wasn't a person, but something that had taken on human form to walk among people. Some people said she had made a terrible deal at some point in her life, giving up her humanity in exchange for powers that no one could understand. Some people swore they had seen her floating a few inches above the ground, or talking to creatures that disappeared when you looked at them. The truth, as always, was more complicated and upsetting than any story. Margaret Ellison was just someone who had learned too much about things that people should have left alone. She had read books that were against the rules, learned languages that are no longer spoken, and figured out symbols that came before writing. And in the cold winter of 1894, in the remote mountains of West Virginia, she was about to use all that knowledge in a way that would change Thornhill forever. The community was on the verge of something that would change everything, and even the cold of winter couldn't stop what would happen in the next few weeks. The full moon in February made the snowy landscape look like a scary dream. The bare trees' shadows stretched out like skeletal fingers across the snow, and the silence was so deep that every breath seemed to echo through the mountains. That night, Margaret Ellison called a meeting of those who had hired her. She called it necessary, but it was not an invitation. It was a summons that made it clear that they had to go. 7 people met in a clearing at the base of the mountain, where old trees made a natural circle. Margaret was in the middle, wearing dark clothes that looked like they absorbed the moonlight instead of reflecting it. Her face was calm, almost angelic, but her eyes were so bright that people around her had to look away. She started to talk in a voice that sounded like it came from far away, saying that all the favors given now needed to be balanced. The universe wanted something in return, and that night would be the time to pay. The people who were there looked at each other nervously, but no one left. There was something about Margaret's presence that made it impossible to leave. She walked around the circle, lightly touching each person's shoulder and speaking in a language that sounded like rocks rolling down a mountain. The air got thicker, and the energy in it made my skin tingle. The stars above seemed to pulse in strange ways, and the moon turned a little red, which no natural event could explain. Then Margaret told the real reason for the meeting. She needed something that they all had, something that couldn't be seen but was very important. She didn't say it was blood or flesh, but rather pieces of will and essence that she called threads in the tapestry of the soul. With these pieces, she would finish a ritual she had been planning since she got to Thornhill. This ritual would open doors between worlds and let influences from other dimensions flow into that reality. She said that everyone would gain from it and that the shared power would grow, but her words sounded empty, like promises made through a veil. People who were there could never fully describe the ceremony that came after. There were circles of movement, chants that seemed to vibrate in the bones, and fingers that traced symbols in the air that left glowing trails. Margaret took things out of her bag that looked like strange artifacts that had been around for a long time. There were stones with writing on them that made no sense, small bones tied together with red threads, and dark mirrors that showed not images, but shadows of things that shouldn't be there. One by one, the people taking part felt something being taken out of them. It didn't hurt physically, but it hurt in a way that made them feel like parts of their identities were being cut off and taken away. They stayed awake the whole time and couldn't fight back or protest. An invisible force held them captive, and Margaret controlled it with precise gestures. When it was all over, everyone felt lighter, but also like they were missing something important but couldn't figure out what it was. That night, for the first time, Margaret smiled, and it was a real smile of victory. She held something in her hands that looked like it was made of light that had hardened. It was alive and pulsing. This was the price she had asked for, the money she would use to buy access to knowledge and powers that went beyond the physical world. With a wave of the hand, the participants were sent home. They staggered back through the snow, feeling like sleepwalkers waking from a nightmare but still stuck in its aftermath. People started to notice small changes in Thornhill in the days that followed. The people who took part in the ritual looked different, as if something deep down in their personalities had changed. They became more obedient and less curious, going through life with a passive acceptance that was different from how they used to be. They didn't talk about that night because they couldn't find the words to describe what had happened. It was like the memories were behind doors that they couldn't get through. On the other hand, Margaret had changed completely. Her power was no longer hidden or subtle. People naturally bowed to her when she walked the streets of Thornhill. Her look could calm storms of anger or bring out deep-seated fears. She didn't need candles or complicated rituals to have an effect anymore. Just being there was enough to change the mood of any room. People came to the boarding house room for advice, healing, or just to feel close to something bigger than everyday life. The Reverend worked harder to show that Margaret was a threat as he saw these changes happen, but people were less and less likely to listen to him. The number of people who came to see Margaret grew, but the number of people who went to church fell. By 1895, when spring finally melted the snow and brought new life to the mountains, Thornhill was no longer a single community. On one side were the Reverend and a few stubborn elders who still didn't want to be influenced by Margaret. On the other hand, there was a growing majority of people who had been affected directly or indirectly by her powers. These were people who now saw the world through different lenses, where old truths had been replaced by darker, more complicated ones. In the spring, wildflowers grew in strange patterns around the boarding house where Margaret lived. There were perfect circles of purple violets, lines of daisies that made geometric shapes, and vines that grew in spirals that went against the laws of nature. People in Thornhill saw these strange things happen with a mix of interest and resignation, as if they had slowly come to terms with the fact that their small town was no longer a place where the rules of reality worked the same way. Now, Margaret didn't go out much during the day. She had turned into a creature that only came out at night, when the sun went down behind the mountains and the shadows started to dance. In the dark hours, she would walk to the edge of the forest, sit on a fallen log, and just watch. Some people said she talked to the trees, while others said she heard voices coming from deep within the earth. Witnesses said they saw pale lights floating around her. These were small spheres of light that moved with purpose, like fireflies. The minister chose to do something more direct. He set up a vigil in front of the boarding house to bring together the faithful, who were still against Margaret's influence. They carried lanterns and sang hymns, their voices rising in defiance of the quiet of the night. Margaret looked out of her bedroom window with a calm, blank expression on her face. She didn't have to talk to them directly. She just reached out to the crowd and slowly closed her fingers, as if she were squeezing something invisible. All of the lanterns started to flicker at the same time. The flames flickered, got smaller until they were almost out, and then, for a brief moment, they exploded with blinding intensity before going back to normal. The singers tripped over their words, and their voices stopped working as if invisible hands had cut their vocal cords. The group fell into a deep silence, and they felt a chill that came from inside their own bodies, not the air. The vigil ended in a matter of minutes, and the people who were there ran home without looking back. After that, the organized opposition to Margaret fell apart. The Reverend kept preaching, but his congregations got smaller and smaller until only a few stubborn elders were left who wouldn't accept that something important had changed in Thornhill. Most of the people who lived there had come to terms with Margaret's presence. Some did so because it was easier, some because they were scared, and many because they really thought she had something useful to offer, even if they couldn't say what it was. Margaret started to teach. She chose 3 people from the community who had a natural talent for seeing the deeper layers of reality. People had always thought they were a little strange because they saw shadows where there shouldn't be any, heard whispers in empty rooms, and dreamed of places they had never been, but that felt more real than waking life. Margaret took them in and taught them bits and pieces of the knowledge she had gained from years of studying things that were not allowed. The lessons were held in the basement of the boarding house, which was dark and damp. Margaret had turned it into what she called a sanctuary. The walls were covered with detailed drawings and diagrams showing how things that shouldn't be connected were connected. There were shelves full of bottles with liquids that were impossible colors, powders that glowed faintly in the dark, and roots that twisted and seemed to move when no one was looking at them. The air down there was heavy and full of smells that could be pleasant or sickening, and they changed in ways that were hard to predict. The apprentices learned everything with a level of dedication that was almost obsessive. Margaret told them about the veils that separate worlds and how biological filters could be removed with the right training to improve human perception. She talked about beings that lived at frequencies outside of normal consciousness. These beings were neither good nor bad, they were just others, who acted according to their own strange logic. She showed how to change the odds and how to whisper suggestions to the fabric of reality so that it would respond. During the hot summer nights of 1895, when the air was still and heavy, strange things started to happen all the time in Thornhill. Things moved on their own. Doors opened and closed without any wind, and mirrors sometimes showed pictures that weren't real. Voices talking about things in languages no one knew came from empty houses. Animals acted more and more strangely, forming groups where species that normally hated each other got along as if old grudges had been forgotten. Margaret watched all of this with academic satisfaction. The ritual had done more than just open a temporary portal. It had changed the fabric of local reality in a way that made it easier for different layers of existence to mix. She called this a weak point. Thornhill had become a liminal place, a threshold between worlds. With enough time and effort, this permeability could be increased even more, turning the small town into something truly special. Margaret looked happy with how far she had come. She had made Thornhill her home, turning the small town into a kind of living experiment. But those who were very aware could tell that she was working towards something bigger. All of the rituals, lessons, and small changes she had made were just ways to get ready. Margaret Ellison had plans that went beyond that small village and dreams that went beyond what any normal person should think about. As summer went on, with its hot nights and long days, the feeling of excitement grew, as if the earth itself were holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. Autumn came back to the mountains with a sad sense of urgency, painting the slopes with amber and crimson colors that seemed stronger than they had in years past. Leaves fell in hypnotic swirls, making patterns on the ground that Margaret looked at with great interest, as if she were reading messages from forces she couldn't see. Her 3 apprentices had learned more than she had expected, picking up skills that had taken Margaret years to learn. They walked through Thornhill with the same strange aura that their teacher had, and their eyes showed depths that shouldn't be able to fit into human minds. At this time, Margaret started to talk openly about her ultimate goal. She brought together not only her apprentices but also the people who had taken part in the ritual in the clearing months before. She told her vision in her makeshift sanctuary in the basement, which was lit by candles with green and blue flames. She said that Thornhill was in a place that was very important from a geometric point of view. The mountains around the area made shapes that looked like constellations in the night sky, which connected Earth and the universe. This alignment could be put to use in a very special way. Margaret talked about a portal, not in the sense of a door, but as a break in the membrane of shared perception. If done right, a ritual of the right size could temporarily break down the barrier between different levels of existence. This opening could let in deep knowledge, channel energies from other dimensions, and turn the people there into something more than just human. She spoke with a controlled passion, and her gestures made pictures in the air of possibilities that were both amazing and scary at the same time. People who heard it had different reactions. Some were really excited and interested in the idea of transcendence. Some people were hesitant because they could sense that Margaret wasn't telling them everything she knew about the risks. But everyone was still interested because of a mix of curiosity, ambition, and the unbreakable bond that had formed between them and Margaret since they had accepted her gifts. She had become the center of their lives, and it seemed impossible to resist her pull, just like it was impossible to resist gravity. The weeks leading up to the big ceremony were spent getting ready. Margaret told each person what their job was and how to do it with mathematical accuracy. She made detailed maps that showed where each person should stand, marked places in the mountains that needed to be blessed with certain symbols, and made a list of rare ingredients that needed to be gathered from deep in the woods. Everyone in the community, even those who weren't directly involved, could feel the tension rising, as if the air were getting thicker every day. The pastor made one last, desperate effort to step in. On a gray October afternoon, he walked up to the boarding house with a heavy Bible and a silver cross that had belonged to his grandfather. Margaret opened the door for him and said hello in a cold way. The fight that followed was short, but very intense. The minister quoted the Bible, called on God's authority, and told Margaret to stop what she was doing right away. She seemed to be patient as she listened, and a small smile played on her lips. When he was done, Margaret just asked if he really believed that his old words had power over things that were around before people even had language. She said she wasn't a threat, but rather a way to get to know each other better. No matter how holy it was, a single book couldn't hold the whole universe. She gave the Reverend a choice: join the ritual and learn truths that went beyond blind faith, or step aside and let others find their own way to God. The minister took a step back because something in Margaret's eyes made him doubt what he believed. It wasn't malice, he thought with a sense of unease, but rather an absolute certainty that made his own belief seem weak by comparison. He left the boarding house without saying a word, and those who saw him later said he looked like he had aged years in just a few hours. He knew with painful clarity that his last try to save Thornhill had failed. Margaret focused all of her attention on the last-minute details. She stayed up all night studying old texts by candlelight and doing complicated math problems that involved the positions of stars and telluric energy currents. Her students watched her with awe, knowing that they were seeing someone who had mastered an art that very few people in history had. They didn't think about the risks or the results. They had changed too much to go back now. Their identities were now too closely tied to Margaret's project for them to ever be able to go back. Thornhill waited in 1895 as November brought its first hints of winter, and the night grew longer, taking up most of the day. The date Margaret picked was getting closer. It was a night when the stars would line up in a certain way, the moon would be hidden, and there would be no light at all. The people taking part were both excited and scared because they knew they were about to cross a line from which they might not be able to come back. Margaret stayed calm and focused in the middle of all the excitement. She kept her eyes on horizons that only she could see clearly. The night they had chosen came, and it was dark in a way that felt real. The thick clouds that had gathered over the mountains, as if answering a silent call, hid the moon and stars. There was no breeze, and the silence was so deep that everyone could hear their own heartbeats like thunder. Margaret picked a narrow valley between two steep hills, where natural echoes made the sound strange. There were 13 people there, which she said was necessary for the right balance of energies. They stood in a big circle, each at a different point that Margaret had marked with the stones that had symbols on them that were painted with dyes made from rare roots and crushed minerals. In the middle of the circle, Margaret had drawn a complicated pattern on the ground. The lines crossed each other to make geometric shapes that looked like they were vibrating when you looked at them for a long time. She started the ritual with a low chant, a tune with no words that sounded like it came from deep within her chest. The people who were there slowly joined in, and their voices formed a strange but beautiful harmony that was out of tune. The sound got louder and echoed through the mountains, and something answered. At first, it was just a feeling of presence, like when you know someone is watching you but can't figure out where they are. Then the air started to pulse in time with the chant, sending invisible waves through the air that made things look a little blurry. Margaret walked around the circle in a calm way, touching each person's forehead with fingers that seemed to give off heat. People felt their minds opening up wherever she touched them, as if barriers were being broken down. They started to see layers of reality that were usually hidden, one by one. The valley around it wasn't just stone and dirt. It was a living tapestry of energies that were all connected. The trees on the hillsides weren't just individual organisms. They were part of a conscious network that went on for miles. The sky wasn't empty. It was full of invisible rivers of forces that flowed like rivers. The ritual got more intense. When Margaret raised her arms, everyone else did the same. She spoke in a language that no living scholar would understand. The syllables seemed to have physical weight, and they fell from the air like stones thrown into still water, making ripples that spread in all directions. The design in the middle of the circle started to glow with a faint but growing light, as if it were taking in light from an unknown source and releasing it at different wavelengths. That's when things really started to change. It looked like the space inside the circle was folding, making depth where there should have been nothing but a flat surface. Shadows moved on their own, making shapes that looked like people, but were bent in ways that didn't fit with Euclidean geometry. People were whispering in different languages at the same time. Some of the sounds were familiar, like ancient human languages, while others were completely strange and shouldn't be possible for vocal cords to make. The participants felt like their views were changing in a big way. Time stopped moving in a straight line, and moments started to overlap and mix. They saw the past and the future at the same time, like the branches of an infinite tree branching out into different versions of reality. Margaret was the calm center of this storm of possibilities, a clear point of reference while everything else fell into organized chaos. Her face was glowing with happiness that was almost ecstasy as she finally saw the results of months of careful planning. Something was going on. It wasn't a physical thing. It was a presence, a huge mind that lightly touched the valley like a finger exploring new ground. It was older than any human measure of time, having been around before the mountains rose from the ground, before the oceans formed, and maybe even before reality took its current shape. And it was interesting, like a light draws in bugs at night, but it was much more careful about how it went about its business. Margaret raised her hands, as if she could reach out and touch that presence and pull it closer. She spoke over the chanting of the group, saying a final prayer that sounded like both a command and a plea. The light in the middle of the circle burst out in a blinding flash that made everyone close their eyes for what felt like an eternity. There was only bright white light, and a sound that was more of a feeling than a sound, a vibration that could be felt in every atom of every body there. And then, all of a sudden, everything stopped. The light went out, the sound stopped, and the feeling of presence faded away. Not completely, but it seemed to have pulled back to watch from a safe distance. The people who were there slowly opened their eyes and blinked in the dark. In the middle of the circle, Margaret was on her knees, breathing heavily. Even though it was cold outside, beads of sweat were rolling down her face. She smiled, but it was a tired smile, the kind that comes after a lot of hard work. She had done it. The portal had opened, even if only for a moment. In that moment, everything in Thornhill and with everyone there had changed forever. There was an eerie stillness in Thornhill for days after the ritual, like a thick fog. Everyone who took part went back to their normal lives, but something important had changed in each of them. They went about their daily lives like actors following a script they already knew, but their eyes had a new depth, as if they could see through things to the hidden mechanisms that made them work. Normal talks about the weather and the harvest now seemed silly and pointless, like words that didn't get to the deeper truths they had seen that night in the valley. After the ritual, Margaret stayed in her room for 3 days, refusing to eat or see anyone. There was a clear difference in how she looked when she finally came out. It wasn't a specific physical mark that made her look younger and older at the same time. It was more of an overall quality. Her movements had a smoothness that seemed to go beyond what a normal body could do. When she talked, her words had soft harmonies, like different voices were playing at the same time but at slightly different frequencies. She called her 3 apprentices to a private meeting in the basement sanctuary. There, in the light of candles that burned without melting the wax, Margaret told the truth about what happened during those times when she felt connected to the presence beyond the veil. She had learned things, not through words or pictures, but through direct understandings that had been planted in her mind like seeds in rich soil. These ideas were now coming to light, showing themselves in layers, each one deeper and more complicated than the last. Margaret said that the universe was not at all like what people thought it was. People lived their whole lives seeing only one color, while millions of others stayed hidden. The reality they experienced was only a thin band of an infinitely wider spectrum. The ritual had made them more aware, letting them see some of these hidden colors, but this was just the start. With time and effort, it would be possible to expand these perceptions even more until they completely went beyond the limits of normal human consciousness. The apprentices listened with the utmost respect, taking in every word as if it were a holy revelation. Margaret told them to start their own experiments, which were small rituals that would test and improve the new skills they had just learned. She gave her clear instructions and warned her about the risks of moving too quickly. She said that the human mind wasn't made to handle certain kinds of information, and that revealing truths that are too big too soon could have bad effects. It was important to build up slowly so that consciousness could adjust at its own speed. At the same time, strange things started happening more and more in the Thornhill community. Things that had been left behind vanished and then showed up in strange places. In the morning, doors that had been painted white would turn blue without anyone touching them. Even when people were standing in front of them, mirrors showed empty rooms. People were talking in languages no one could understand in abandoned houses. Animals acted more and more strangely, forming groups where species that normally hated each other got along as if old grudges had been forgotten. Margaret watched all of this with academic satisfaction. The ritual had done more than just open a temporary portal. It had changed the fabric of local reality in a way that made it easier for different layers of existence to mix. She called this a weak point. Thornhill had become a liminal place, a threshold between worlds. With enough time and effort, this permeability could be increased even more, turning the small community into something truly one of a kind. The winter of 1895 came back with a vengeance, bringing blizzards that kept Thornhill completely cut off from the outside world for weeks. But the people who lived there didn't seem to mind being alone. In fact, a lot of people felt a strange sense of relief, as if not being connected to the outside world let something special grow between them. The long, dark nights turned into times when people got together in homes warmed by fireplaces and shared stories that would have sounded crazy just a few months ago. They talked about shared dreams, in which many people went to the same impossible places while they slept. They talked about times when thoughts flowed between minds without the need for words. They talked about seeing things that hadn't happened yet, premonitions that came true with scary accuracy. Margaret went to these meetings and gave people advice and context. She helped them understand and control their new skills instead of letting them control them. The Reverend had become a sad and lonely person. His church had gotten so small that it was almost gone. He preached to empty pews, his voice echoing in the cold chapel, warning people that no one else wanted to hear. He was no longer important. He was just a remnant of a time Thornhill had left behind. Margaret felt sorry for him because she knew that he was just as dedicated to his idea of truth as she was to hers. But their truths were not the same, and in such a small space, only one could win. On a very cold night, Margaret had a vision. She was awake and sitting by her bedroom window, watching the snow fall in hypnotic patterns. It wasn't a dream. The vision came to her as a sudden flash of understanding, showing her how her future could go in many different ways. She saw Thornhill change into a beacon of hidden knowledge that drew people from all over the country. She saw the community growing, not in size, but in influence, with its discoveries spreading through the wider culture like ripples. She thought that people in the future would look back and see that winter was a turning point in history. But she also saw risks. She saw beings beyond the veil that had noticed the opening made by the ritual and were now watching Thornhill. Some of these beings were just curious passive observers who wanted to learn more about this strange thing. Some people had less good intentions and saw the community as a way to change the physical world in ways that were usually not allowed for them. Margaret knew she would have to set up defenses and barriers that would let good connections happen while keeping bad ones away. In the days that followed, she worked non-stop with her apprentices to put these protections in place. They put up lines of defense around Thornhill. These weren't real walls, but ideas that would act as filters. They were made up of intention and symbolism. Margaret taught that protection wasn't about being completely alone, but about being able to tell who is who, like a door that lets guests in but keeps intruders out. The protections they put in place would let energy and information flow that would help the community while keeping out people who could do harm. The work was tiring because it required constant focus and exactness. Margaret stayed up all night making changes to the protection patterns and testing how well they worked in ways that only she knew how to do. Her students watched with increasing respect, knowing that they were seeing someone who had mastered an art that very few people in history had ever mastered to such a high level. They learned as much as they could, knowing that it would take years, maybe even decades, to get as good as Margaret was at what she did. The protections were in place when February came, with its slightly longer days and timid hints of spring. Thornhill was now in a bubble of perception, a place that was in the world but also a little separate from it, like an island of a different reality floating in an ocean of normality. People who lived there felt this separation naturally. The mountains around them looked both very close and very far away at the same time. There was something different about the sky, as if it had been seen through a soft filter that changed the colors and brightness a little. Margaret finally let herself take a break. She had done what she came to Thornhill to do, turn the small town into a living experiment of what people could do if they had more options. What would happen next would depend on her and everyone else who had been affected by what she had done. She had planted seeds that would grow in ways that she couldn't even imagine. Margaret Ellison smiled to herself as she sat in her room and watched the snow dance forever. She was happy to know that she had made a lasting change in the world, a change in the fabric of reality that would continue to have an effect long after she was gone. In the spring of 1896, Thornhill changed in ways that went beyond the wildflowers and the melting mountains. The community's atmosphere had changed, becoming dreamy and making people who came to visit feel like they had entered a place that followed rules that were a little different from those in the rest of the world. The few travelers who still came through the area said that when they got there they felt disoriented, as if they had crossed an invisible line between the normal and the extraordinary. Margaret had started writing down what she found in a huge journal. The pages were full of beautiful handwriting that sometimes turned into complicated symbols and diagrams. She didn't write to keep secrets. She wrote to organize her thoughts, which were getting bigger and more connected. Her notes talked about everything from useful observations about certain rituals to philosophical musings about what consciousness and reality are. The journal was turning into a personal grimoire, a map of new places she was discovering as she went along. Her 3 students had made great progress. The oldest, a 40-year-old man who had worked as a blacksmith before, could now control small currents of energy, making things float for a short time, or changing the temperature of liquids with just his mind. The second apprentice, a woman who had been a midwife before joining Margaret, became very good at sensing how other people were feeling and what was going on with their bodies. She could read their minds like they were open books. The third person, a young man who had always been seen as strange even before he met Margaret, could now enter altered states of consciousness at will and explore mental landscapes that were beyond the reach of the physical brain. Margaret put together what she called an inner circle, a small group of practitioners who met regularly to work on experiments together. These meetings happened in the basement sanctuary and in certain places in the nearby mountains where telluric energies were strongest. They worked on a lot of different projects, such as trying to talk to non-human consciousnesses and looking into healing methods that went beyond traditional medicine. Each experiment was meticulously documented, with successes and failures noted with equal diligence. One of the most important things the inner circle found out was what Margaret called collective resonance. When a group of people used certain meditation and chanting techniques to sync up their minds, they made a unified field that was much stronger than the sum of its parts. In this state of resonance, the group could do things that no one person could do alone. They moved heavy things without touching them, changed the weather in the area, and even made plants grow faster by making seeds germinate in a few hours instead of days. The larger Thornhill community had split into different groups. At the center was Margaret's close group of friends, the dedicated practitioners who had fully embraced the new possibilities. There were people around them who agreed with what was going on and supported it, even though they didn't take part in the rituals. Further out, people who lived with the strange things and accepted them as part of the new normal. And on the edges, a few people who held on to old certainties would sometimes meet in the empty chapel with the reverend to pray for the community's salvation. Margaret didn't try to change the minds of these people who were against her. She knew that real change couldn't be forced. It could only be given. People who were ready to change how they saw things would do so on their own. The others would live their lives within the limits they set for themselves, which was also okay. There was room in the universe for many points of view and many realities to exist at the same time without canceling each other out. Thornhill had become a small version of this diversity, a place where different ways of living shared the same physical space but lived in different mental worlds. At this point, Margaret started to feel what she called temporal projection. It wasn't time travel in the strictest sense, but rather an ability to move her mind through different points on the timeline, looking at things that had happened in the past and things that might happen in the future. She learned that time was not a straight line, as most people think, but a complicated landscape where the past, present, and future all existed at the same time. Each moment was connected to all the others in a web of causality that went in many directions. Margaret learned that Thornhill had a deeper history than she had thought when she had these experiences of temporal projection. Many different groups of people had used the valley for similar purposes over the years because they knew how important it was. She saw visions of natives doing ceremonies there hundreds of years ago, of European colonists being drawn to the place without knowing why, and of generations of people feeling the call of that place without fully understanding why. Thornhill was not an accident of geography. It was a natural place where the membranes between different realities were naturally thinner. Margaret told her close friends about these findings and said that they were not pioneers, but rather continuers of a much older tradition. This made them feel connected to long-lost families and aware that they were part of something bigger than themselves. The apprentices felt a heavy sense of duty because they knew that the skills they were learning would have to be kept alive and passed down to future generations, keeping a flame of knowledge alive that most people had long since put out. It was hot and humid in the summer, and there were amazing storms that swept across the mountains with howling winds and lightning that seemed to dance between the peaks. Margaret loved these storms because they made her feel alive. She would stay in her room with the windows open, letting the wind and rain in. The electricity in the air made her shiver. During the worst thunderstorms, she would go into trance-like states and use the storm's energy to help her explore deeper and deeper parts of her mind. Margaret had her first direct and long-lasting contact with one of the beings beyond the veil during one of these storms. It wasn't talking in symbols or vague impressions. It was more like a conversation, but without words in the usual sense. The being only called itself an observer, a consciousness that had existed for countless eons and had seen many civilizations grow in many dimensions. It was especially interested in Margaret because it saw in her a level of growth that is rare in people. The entity gave Margaret information that would greatly increase her abilities, but it also warned her of the costs. As you grew, you had to let go of something from your old self. You became more of a person, but you also became less of a person in the traditional sense. It was a path of change that could not be undone, and the entity wanted Margaret to fully understand what that meant before moving on. Margaret thought carefully about her choices, weighing her desire to succeed against her desire to stay safe, and then, with complete clarity of purpose, she agreed. After that meeting, Margaret changed in both small and big ways. She looked like the same person who had come to Thornhill 2 years before. But anyone who was very sensitive could tell that something important had changed. Her eyes now had a depth that seemed to go on forever, like wells that went deeper than anyone could understand. Her words echoed at different frequencies when she spoke, as if each sentence had layers of meaning that slowly became clear to the listener. She moved through space with a grace that was hard to put into words. Every gesture was full of purpose and beauty, as if unseen forces had planned them. The information the entity had shared was too much for Margaret to take in all at once. It unfolded in her mind like flowers opening in slow motion, with each petal revealing more and more complexity. She learned about the structures of reality and how different dimensions are woven together like threads in an endless tapestry. She learned that consciousness didn't come from matter. Instead, matter was a temporary form of conscious patterns that had crystallized. She knew that the universe wasn't just a machine that worked according to blind laws. It was a living thing that was aware of things on levels that were far beyond what most people could understand. Margaret started teaching these ideas to her close friends, but she soon realized that most of them couldn't really understand what she was saying. She learned that the way human minds are built makes it impossible for them to understand some things. It was like trying to explain colors to someone who was born blind, or music to someone who had never heard sound. The words weren't good enough, and the ideas were too strange to fit into the mental categories that people had made. She would have to come up with new ways to communicate that didn't rely on talking. This is how Margaret came up with what she called direct transference. It was a way for her to touch a learner's forehead and make a temporary connection between their minds. Through this connection, information didn't come as words or pictures, but as pure ideas that went straight into the mind of the person receiving them. The process was hard and tiring for both people. Margaret felt like she was pouring part of herself into another vessel, and the person receiving it suddenly grew, which could be so disorienting that it made them feel sick and dizzy. Her 3 main apprentices went through these transfers with different levels of success. The blacksmith learned how to control physical energies, which gave him the ability to shape metal with his hands and change the molecular properties of materials just by thinking about it. The former midwife's ability to empathize grew to incredible levels. She could not only sense how others were feeling, but also change how they felt in subtle ways, like easing pain or lifting spirits just by being there. The strange young man, on the other hand, had a harder time. He learned so much so quickly that it was hard for him to keep a clear sense of who he was. For a few weeks, he went in and out of different states of consciousness. Sometimes he seemed fully present, and other times he wandered through mental landscapes that were hard for him to get back to. Margaret worked patiently with him, helping him find things that would keep him grounded in consensual reality while he explored more strange places. She taught him grounding techniques, which are ways to keep one foot in the real world while the other foot walks in other dimensions. The young man slowly learned how to move between states, which gave him a flexibility of mind that would later become one of his greatest strengths. He could now easily switch between normal and expanded perception, allowing him to work well on many levels of reality at the same time. The fall of 1896 brought with it a color intensity that turned the mountains into a visual symphony of reds, oranges, and golds. Margaret spent a lot of time walking the trails, taking in the beauty of the season that would soon be gone. She had started to see patterns in everything, noticing how natural cycles were similar to much bigger processes in the universe. Plants that looked like they were dead in the fall weren't really dead. They were changing, and their energy was going into forms that were less visible but just as real. Every leaf that fell was a small example of how things change and start over. Margaret often ran into the Reverend on these walks, as he also sought solitude in the mountains. Their meetings were strange and full of tension that wasn't hostile. They had become symbols of opposing but not necessarily hostile ideas. The Reverend still thought Margaret was dangerously wrong, but he had stopped trying to fight her. She respected his dedication, even though she didn't agree with how he saw the world. They sometimes talked for a short time about things that weren't too personal, like the weather or how pretty the scenery was. Other times, they just nodded at each other and went their separate ways. Margaret started to notice that her being in Thornhill was drawing attention from people outside of the area. People who had heard rumors about the strange woman in the mountains who taught ancient secrets would come by from time to time. Some were really curious seekers who thought something was missing from their lives and wanted to find out what it was. Some people were skeptics who came to prove that what they thought was a scam was not. Margaret treated everyone with the same respect. She offered to show off her skills to anyone who asked, but she never tried to convince skeptics of anything against their will. Margaret gave basic lessons to people who showed they were interested and capable. She set up an informal teaching structure that started with simple meditation and exercises to help students become more aware. As students showed they were ready, she moved on to more difficult techniques. Some stayed in Thornhill for weeks or months, learning as much as they could before going back home with seeds of knowledge to plant in other places. Margaret thought of this as part of a bigger project to spread a higher level of consciousness that would change not only Thornhill, but also the rest of society in small waves. There were 7 people in Margaret's inner circle, and each one brought something different to the table. They worked together to find out what was possible by coordinating their actions. They made up rituals that could change the way a group of people thought, making them feel like they were in different realities. They tried distance healing, which means sending good thoughts to people who are far away and seeming to change their physical health. They worked with group dreams, getting together in dreamscapes that they all built together so they could explore situations that couldn't happen in real life. One of the most interesting things they did was what they called dimensional cartography. They used altered states of consciousness to map areas that were outside of physical space, finding places of special importance where the membranes between worlds were very thin. They found that these places made up a network across the continent, with invisible lines of energy connecting them. The continent's ancient people seem to have known about and used these lines. Thornhill was at one of these points, but there were many more that were spread out in ways that looked like they were planned or were just the way the planet's natural shape is. Margaret carefully wrote down everything in her ever-growing journal, which now filled several leather-bound books. Because Margaret had come to terms with her own death, she wrote not just for herself but also for future generations who would carry on her work after she was gone. She knew that her time in the physical body was limited, and that the changes she had gone through had costs. Every time her consciousness grew, it burned a little more of her physical existence. She didn't mind this, though, because she saw it as necessary and valuable. Margaret did another big ritual in late 1896. It was smaller than the first one, but it had a clearer purpose. This time, the goal wasn't to open general portals. Instead, it was to set up a permanent link between Thornhill and certain specific frequencies of expanded consciousness. She made what she called a beacon, a signal that would constantly send out waves through subtle dimensions. This would draw in good beings and advanced consciousnesses while keeping bad ones away. The ritual took 3 full nights to finish. The inner circle stayed focused the whole time by using group meditation techniques. Everyone who took part in the ritual said that the mood in Thornhill had changed in a big way. It was like there was an invisible barrier around them that let some energies through while keeping others out. The community was now in a state of permanent, heightened resonance, a place where new opportunities were always available. People in Thornhill started to notice more synchronicities, moments of deep understanding that came out of nowhere, and dreams that gave them clear messages and advice. Margaret was very happy to see all of this happen. She had made something that would last, a change in the way things were that would keep working even after she was gone. Thornhill had turned into a living lab for expanded consciousness, showing people things about themselves that most people didn't even know were possible. Even though she knew she didn't have much time left, Margaret was at peace with the legacy she was leaving behind. She had changed the world in ways that would last for generations, planting seeds that would grow in ways that were impossible to predict but would have a huge effect. That night, the stars shone unusually brightly over the West Virginia mountains, as if the universe itself were watching and approving the work that had been done in that small, remote valley between old peaks. Winter came back to the mountains, bringing with it the familiar quiet. It covered Thornhill in a white blanket that made everything seem less real. Margaret spent her days in peaceful thought, watching the snow fall outside her bedroom window as she thought about everything that had been built during those amazing years. She felt the weight of her accomplishments, not as a burden, but as the deep satisfaction of someone who had achieved a goal that was bigger than their own goals. Her apprentices had become masters in their own right, able to do the work without her help. The inner circle was now like a living thing, with each member bringing their own point of view while still working together through shared practices. Margaret watched their talks and experiments with quiet pride, knowing that she had made something that would last beyond her life, a tradition that would continue through the generations. The Thornhill community had found its own strange balance. People who were open to new ideas and people who wanted to hold on to what they knew lived together in peace. There was no more open fighting. Everyone agreed that different paths could exist in the same space. Even the pastor seemed to have come to terms with the situation. He kept preaching to his small group of followers, knowing that he couldn't and didn't need to convert the whole community to his vision. Margaret started getting ready to leave. She didn't know exactly when it would come, but she could feel it coming as a small change in the flow of her own life. She put her writing in order and left clear instructions on how to keep and share her diaries. She spent time alone with each person in the inner circle, giving them last-minute advice and sharing information she hadn't shared before. There was a lot of emotion in each conversation, and it was clear that these were lessons that were really farewells. Margaret's last walk through the mountains was on a snowy afternoon. She climbed up to the valley where the first great ritual had taken place, a place of power where so many changes had happened. The snow covered the symbols that had been drawn on the ground, but the energy of the place was still there, vibrating at frequencies that only trained minds could pick up on. Margaret stayed there for a long time, just feeling and taking in the spirit of that special place that had brought about so many changes. When Margaret got back to the guest house, she gathered everyone who had walked with her on that amazing journey one last time. This time, there were no complicated ceremonies, just a small group of people sharing simple words. She talked about being thankful and how everyone there had done something that was bigger than themselves. She told them that the work was just starting and that Thornhill was just a seed. It was up to them to make sure that this seed grew and spread, changing other people's lives and inspiring other changes. One spring morning, Margaret Ellison left Thornhill. The thaw turned the mountains into flowing streams, and the first green shoots started to come up from the still cold ground. No one knew for sure where she went. Some people said she just walked into the woods and disappeared among the trees, becoming part of the land itself. Others said she moved to a higher level of existence, one that was beyond the limits of physical form. Like many truths in Thornhill, the truth was still a mystery. There was no denying what she left behind: a changed community, people who had broadened their views beyond what was normal, knowledge preserved in carefully written pages, and most importantly, a living example that reality was much more flexible and full of possibilities than most people thought. Thornhill remained a place on the edge, where people who wanted to learn more could find doors that led to new areas of consciousness. As the years went by, Margaret Ellison's story became a legend, told and retold with changes that added layers of myth to the core of truth. Some people saw her as a hero, others as a mysterious figure, and many just didn't know what to think of her unclear legacy. But for those who really understood, who had been directly affected by her teachings, or the teachings of her students, Margaret was still an example of what people could do if they really tried. She was living proof that there were other ways to go than the ones most people took. The Appalachian Mountains kept their secrets safe, as they always had, and didn't care what people thought about them. The valley where rituals were held was still a powerful place that only a few people knew how to recognize its importance. Some people said they felt a familiar presence walking the trails on moonless nights, when the barrier between worlds was especially thin. This presence was a consciousness that had gone beyond the limits of human life, but still felt a strong connection to the place where so much had changed. Margaret Ellison's story in the dark mountains of West Virginia is still a reminder of what can happen when you question the limits of what is known, when curiosity wins out over fear of the unknown, and when the search for deeper understanding becomes more important than the safety of not knowing. It is a story that has been told for a long time, in circles that value mystery over certainty, that choose exploration over stagnation, and that know that the universe is much stranger and more wonderful than any words can describe. Until the next story, when we will once again explore places where the impossible becomes possible, and the unknown shows itself in all its unsettling glory.